The lobby of the towering glass skyscraper gleamed with polished marble floors and the hum of busy professionals rushing to and from meetings. But, amid the rhythm of clicking heels and hushed conversations, a moment was about to unfold that would expose the hidden rot festering beneath its glossy surface. A moment where arrogance and prejudice collided head-on with quiet power. A man in a perfectly tailored suit walked confidently toward the reception desk, his polished shoes reflecting the glow of overhead lights. His presence dignified yet understated, the kind of aura that made people turn their heads without even knowing why. But instead of recognition or respect, he was met with narrowed eyes and a dismissive smirk from the receptionist, who sat perched behind the counter, tapping her manicured nails impatiently, as though his very existence disrupted her routine. She glanced him up and down with a look that dripped with unspoken judgment, and without a word, he could already sense the wall of prejudice forming in her mind. An assumption that he did not belong here, that he was just another outsider wandering where he shouldn't, when he introduced himself and mentioned he was here for an important meeting. Her laugh cut through the air like a blade, sharp and mocking, echoing louder in the vast lobby than she intended. Heads turned, conversations paused. A few smirks appeared on the faces of those who overheard her contemptuous tone. She leaned forward and told him flatly that he must be mistaken, that people like him don't get meetings with executives upstairs. Her words laced with the kind of casual cruelty that comes only from unchecked privilege. For a fleeting second, silence swallowed the room, as if the marble walls themselves held their breath, waiting for his reaction. Would he lash out? Would he argue? Would he storm off in humiliation? Instead, he simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that seemed out of place, almost unsettling in its calmness. Without another word, he stepped back, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked away, leaving behind whispers, sneers, and the smug satisfaction of the receptionist who believed she had put him in his place. But what no one in that lobby knew, not the bystanders, not the smirking receptionist, not even the executives waiting upstairs, was that this man was not a lost visitor, not a dreamer chasing an impossible appointment. He was the very person their company had been waiting for, the one individual with the power to change their fate forever. And in just a matter of minutes, the roles would be reversed, the truth would be revealed, and the arrogance on display in that lobby would come crashing down with a force that would leave the entire company shaken to its core. The man who had just been dismissed as if he were nobody was in fact Jonathan Price, a name that carried weight in boardrooms across the nation, though he rarely flaunted it. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations low, he had carved his path with relentless determination. Graduating at the top of his class, building businesses from the ground up, and eventually rising to become the CEO of a powerhouse investment firm known for reshaping struggling companies into global players, Jonathan's journey was one marked by resilience, by nights when he studied under dim lights after working shifts to support his family, by the constant whispers of those who doubted him because of his skin color, and by the unyielding fire inside him that refused to let their prejudice dictate his destiny. Now, standing in the lobby of a corporation that had summoned him for a meeting that could determine their survival, he was once again confronted with the same dismissive attitude he had faced countless times before, the assumption that he did not belong. The skyscraper itself loomed above the city as a symbol of wealth and exclusivity, a towering monument of glass and steel that screamed of power. Yet behind its walls, the culture remained mired in outdated thinking, clinging to biases that had no place in the modern world. The receptionist, polished in appearance yet small-minded in perspective, represented not just herself, but an entire structure that judged a man's worth by the color of his skin rather than the brilliance of his mind. As Jonathan stood momentarily in the lobby, brushing off the sting of her words, his mind drifted back to the people who had underestimated him before, the teachers who told him not to aim too high, the investors who questioned whether a black entrepreneur could handle million-dollar deals, the competitors who laughed until they watched him overtake them one by one. Each slight, each insult, Each barrier had built in him a calmness that could weather storms and a confidence that thrived in the face of arrogance. Yet he also knew that perception mattered, that in environments like this lobby, the way he carried himself would speak louder than any rebuttal he could offer. That was why, instead of responding with anger, he walked away with dignity. Already envisioning the shock that would ripple across the same faces when they realized the truth. The irony was almost poetic. This very company had reached out to him, desperate for a lifeline after months of financial decline. Their executives hoping he could engineer a turnaround that would save them from collapse. But those details had not reached the ears of the front desk staff, who saw only what they wanted to see. And in that blind judgment, they revealed more about the culture of the organization than any report ever could. Jonathan's presence in that building was not an accident, not a coincidence, but the result of years of hard work, credibility, and a reputation for results that spoke louder than introductions. The board members upstairs were waiting for him anxiously, reviewing notes, rehearsing pitches, and calculating how much of their pride they could swallow in exchange for survival. And yet, just one floor below, he had been dismissed as if he were invisible, his identity stripped down to stereotypes and assumptions. The duality of that moment, being both desperately needed and casually discarded, painted a vivid picture of the contradictions Black professionals often faced in corporate spaces, where brilliance was celebrated in boardrooms but questioned in lobbies, where accomplishments were acknowledged only after credentials were proven beyond doubt. Jonathan adjusted his watch as he made his way toward the elevators, his stride steady, his expression calm. Yet within him, a storm of emotions swirled. The frustration of being reduced to nothing in an instant. The weight of carrying not just his own dignity, but the example he set for those who looked up to him. And the quiet anticipation of the moment when the tables would turn. He was not a man who sought revenge, but he was a man who understood impact. And he knew that sometimes the most powerful statement was not in what you said in the heat of an insult, but in what you revealed after silence. As he ascended the glass-walled elevator, watching the city shrink below, his reflection stared back at him. Not of someone defeated, but of someone who had weathered storms greater than this. And in that reflection, he saw not only his own journey, but the faces of countless others who had been told they didn't belong. The stage was set. The players were in motion. And though the receptionist thought she had dismissed a nobody, she had unknowingly set the scene for a revelation that would not only humiliate her, but also shake the company she represented, leaving a mark that would be remembered long after the lights in that gleaming lobby dimmed. As the elevator doors opened to the top floor, Jonathan Price stepped into an atmosphere that contrasted starkly with the humiliating experience he had just endured in the lobby. For here, the air was thick with urgency, anxiety, and the faint, an undertone of desperation that comes when an empire teeters on the brink of collapse. Yet, even as the executives, polished in their tailored suits and rehearsed smiles, stood clustered around the long mahogany table, whispering nervously to each other about market losses and dwindling investor trust, Jonathan carried with him the sting of being dismissed below. The receptionist's mocking laughter, still echoing faintly in his ears, like a reminder that no matter how far he had climbed, the climb was never truly finished when prejudice shadowed every step. He walked into the boardroom with the calm composure of a man who knew his worth. His name already whispered among the directors, who straightened immediately at his arrival, suddenly aware that the meeting they had dreaded was about to begin. But his mind lingered on the symbolism of the moment, that downstairs he was treated as invisible, and upstairs he was viewed as indispensable. The irony wrapped itself around him like armor, fueling the silent determination etched across his face, as introductions were exchanged, with nervous hands extending across the polished table. He noted the subtle flickers of surprise in some of their eyes when they realized he was the man they had been waiting for. It was not that they had not known his name, but many had not expected a black CEO to be the savior they had been courting. And in those micro-expressions, Jonathan saw a reflection of the very culture that had allowed the receptionist to dismiss him without hesitation. The stakes in the room were enormous. The company's stock had plummeted in recent months. Scandals had rattled investor trust, and whispers of bankruptcy loomed like storm clouds over their empire, and Jonathan held the keys to a plan that could either salvage their reputation or seal their downfall. He spread out the documents he had prepared, charts and projections meticulously crafted, his voice measured and deliberate as he outlined pathways to recovery. Yet, even as he spoke, a flicker of unease stirred within him, a quiet anger restrained beneath professionalism, for he knew that while the executives nodded and scribbled notes, their respect was not born from the recognition of his brilliance alone, but from the desperation of their circumstances. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, not just to prove himself yet again, but to expose the broader injustice that lurked like a shadow in every corner of the building. His memory replayed the lobby scene in fragments, the smirk, the laughter, the mocking words, and with each passing second, he understood more deeply that this meeting was no longer just about business, but about holding a mirror up to the very culture that had dismissed him. He took pauses deliberately, letting silence stretch as the executives leaned forward anxiously, their hunger for his approval almost palpable. And in those pauses he measured not just their financial desperation, but the fragility of the arrogance that had built the skyscraper they sat within. Downstairs, the receptionist likely carried on with her work, unaware of the storm brewing above her, oblivious to the fact that the man she had written off as unworthy was, in that very moment, holding the fate of her employer in his hands. Jonathan, always composed, always deliberate, felt the dual tension pulling at him. The part of him that wanted to act swiftly, seal the deal, and walk away with another success under his belt, and the part of him that wanted to let them squirm, to let them taste the humiliation he had endured in the marble lobby where whispers had branded him as out of place. He spoke of restructuring, of new strategies, of innovative partnerships, all the while weaving his words with a subtle edge that made it clear he was in control, that he was not merely a consultant but a gatekeeper to survival. The emotional stakes mounted with every detail he revealed, the company's employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance, the shareholders whose faith had been shattered, the communities that depended on the business's stability, all of it resting in the hands of a man they had underestimated until desperation forced them to see him clearly. Jonathan's eyes scanned the room, catching every nervous glance, every shifting chair, every anxious sip of water, and beneath it all he saw the truth. They respected him now because they needed him. But their culture, their biases, their blind spots remained unchanged, and this realization hardened his resolve. Rising action surged in him like a tide, the moment swelling not only with the tension of corporate collapse, but with the weight of centuries of injustice replaying themselves in subtler but equally cutting ways. He knew the climax of this story would not be in the numbers he presented but in the revelation of who he was, and how easily they had all been complicit in the same prejudice that humiliated him just minutes earlier. As the board members leaned in, their pens scratching furiously, their nods eager, Jonathan carried with him not only the fate of a corporation, but the symbolic reckoning of a culture that for too long had underestimated men who looked like him. The walls of the skyscraper seemed to close in, the polished wood table reflecting his calm face like a mirror of quiet power. And in that reflection he saw both the boy from the neighborhood who had been told not to dream and the man who now stood poised to deliver a reckoning, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. The injustice of the lobby encounter lingered like smoke, coloring every word he spoke, raising the stakes beyond profit and loss into a battle of dignity and respect. The tension built, heavy and unavoidable, setting the stage for a moment when the mask of corporate arrogance would slip, when truth would thunder louder than prejudice, and when the man they had dismissed as nothing would reveal himself as the force capable of bringing everything they had built crashing down. The room reached a fever pitch of tension as Jonathan Price paused mid-sentence, his voice cutting off in deliberate silence that made every executive freeze. Pens dangling in midair, eyes fixed on him as though the future itself hinged on the next words that would fall from his lips, and in that heavy stillness he slowly closed the folder of projections he had been sharing. folded his hands neatly on the polished mahogany table, and let the weight of his calm gaze sweep across the room, forcing them to confront the man they had underestimated before ever knowing who he was. Then, with a measured tone sharper than any accusation, he began recounting what had happened just moments earlier in the gleaming lobby below, describing how the receptionist had mocked him, laughed at his name, and told him in front of strangers that someone like him could not possibly have business with people of their status. The words dripping with prejudice and casual cruelty. A stunned silence filled the air as faces blanched, eyes widened, and several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The shame of recognition spreading like wildfire, for though none of them had witnessed it directly, they all knew it was plausible, all too consistent with the very culture they had allowed to fester within their walls. Jonathan did not raise his voice, did not pound the table, did not let anger taint the authority in his words. Instead, he spoke with the calm precision of a man wielding truth as his sharpest weapon, every sentence cutting deeper into their pride, every detail painting a picture of arrogance and ignorance that now stood exposed under the cold fluorescent lights of their boardroom. He reminded them, without exaggeration, that their company had begged for this meeting, that they had reached out to him as a savior to prevent their empire from collapsing. And yet, in their own lobby, in the heart of the building they claimed represented excellence, he was reduced to a stereotype and treated like an intruder. His words carried the sting of humiliation, not just for himself, but for every talented individual dismissed, disrespected, and devalued, simply for not fitting into someone else's narrow definition of power. And as he let the silence stretch, after his story, the executives seemed to shrink in their seats. Caught between guilt, fear, and the dawning realization that their savior was now their judge, Jonathan leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable, then placed his final words like a gavel striking down on their collective arrogance. He would not be partnering with a company whose culture mirrored the very discrimination he had fought his entire life to overcome. He would not rescue an institution that mocked the very people it pretended to serve, and instead, he would ensure that their competitors, the ones who embraced diversity, respect, and dignity, received the opportunities they were about to lose. The effect was electric. Gasps broke through the silence. One director dropped his pen, another rubbed his temples in despair, and the CEO of the struggling corporation buried his face in his hands, realizing that in the span of a few minutes, the lifeline they had prayed for had slipped away, not because of financial missteps, but because of arrogance, ignorance, and prejudice embedded so deeply it blinded their gatekeepers. Jonathan stood, adjusted his cufflinks with the same calm poise he had carried since entering, and without raising his voice, delivered the final, devastating truth that the receptionist's laughter, their assumptions, their silence, all of it had cost them not just their dignity, but their future. Then, as he turned to leave, the once powerful executives who had believed themselves untouchable were left in stunned silence. The empire they had built teetering closer to collapse, and in the echo of his footsteps, leaving the boardroom, the weight of justice resounded louder than any deal ever could. As Jonathan stepped out of the boardroom and into the echoing hallway, the weight of the moment followed him like a shadow. Not heavy on his own shoulders, but pressing down on those he had left behind, those who now sat in silence, reckoning with the truth that arrogance and prejudice had cost them everything they thought was secure. Yet for Jonathan, there was no bitterness, no lingering desire for revenge. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his success and dignity had spoken louder than any insult ever could. Word of the confrontation spread quickly throughout the company and beyond. Whispered first in hushed tones among staff, and then blazing across professional networks, news outlets, and social media, each retelling carrying the sting of shame for the executives and a spark of hope for those who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or disrespected because of the color of their skin. For the employees in that building who had long endured subtle slights, unfair promotions, and the silent chokehold of bias, Jonathan's stand became a beacon. Proof that power did not lie in titles or glass towers, but in integrity, resilience, and the courage to hold prejudice accountable. The company, once a symbol of dominance, began to unravel in the weeks that followed as partners pulled away. Investors demanded answers, and clients turned to competitors whose values aligned with respect and inclusion, and in every headline that chronicled their downfall, the unspoken truth was evident. They had not been destroyed by financial loss or market forces, but by the arrogance that blinded them to the worth of others. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued building his empire. Not through the ruins of those who disrespected him, but by uplifting organizations and individuals who believed in fairness, equality, and vision beyond skin color, ensuring that his legacy would not just be wealth, but a reminder that true leadership breaks barriers rather than reinforcing them. And for those who heard his story, whether in boardrooms, classrooms, or quiet living rooms, the question lingered like a challenge echoing into the future. How many brilliant minds, how many innovators, how many leaders have been turned away at doors where prejudice sat guarding opportunity? And how much stronger could we be if dignity, not bias, determined who belonged? In the end, Jonathan's triumph was not measured by the collapse of a corrupt company, but by the seed of awareness his actions planted in every witness. A reminder that racism, whether subtle or brazen, carries a cost far greater than anyone can afford, and that justice sometimes arrives not in grand courtrooms or public protests, but in the silent, devastating choice of a man who simply refuses to compromise his worth. As the story of the black CEO, who turned humiliation into a company's downfall, continued to ripple outward, it left behind not only the wreckage of prejudice, exposed, but also an enduring truth for all who heard it. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not negotiable, and no system built on exclusion will ever stand the test of time. The lobby of the towering glass skyscraper gleamed with polished marble and the energy of ambition. But beneath its shine lay the invisible threads of arrogance and prejudice waiting to be revealed in the cruelest way. For when Jonathan Price, a man of quiet confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, stepped forward toward the reception desk, he carried not only the weight of his own identity, but also the legacy of countless moments where worth had been judged not by character or accomplishment, but by the color of one's skin. And in that moment, his dignity collided head-on with ignorance, disguised as gatekeeping. The receptionist's narrowed eyes scanned him with suspicion, and before he could fully introduce himself, her mocking laugh echoed across the pristine lobby, telling him coldly that people like him didn't belong in meetings with executives. Upstairs, a dismissal that drew amused smirks from bystanders while silencing any hint of respect, reducing him from a man of accomplishment to a stereotype in a heartbeat. With remarkable composure, Jonathan stepped back, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked away without anger, carrying with him a calm smile that unsettled those watching. A smile not of defeat, but of certainty, for what the receptionist didn't know was that this so-called intruder was not only the man they had been waiting for, but the very leader whose decisions could alter the company's fate. Minutes later, in the boardroom above, he commanded the attention of every executive with his poise and intellect, laying out opportunities that could have saved their failing empire. But then, with deliberate timing, he brought the silence to a breaking point. Folding his hands as he recounted the humiliation he had just endured in their own lobby, his words delivered with precision and dignity as he revealed how their receptionist, representing their culture, had dismissed him with prejudice, mocking the very man they had begged to meet. The air grew heavy, the once confident executives shrinking in shame as they realized the bitter truth, that arrogance had blinded them and their culture of unchecked bias had just cost them the very lifeline they needed to survive. Jonathan's refusal to partner with them was not loud or vengeful. It was calm, resolute, and devastating. A quiet gavel of justice falling on their arrogance as he turned to leave, letting them drown in the reality that their downfall would not come from competitors or markets, but from the prejudice festering within their own walls. In the weeks that followed, their collapse became public. Headlines screaming of lost deals and broken trust. Their downfall chronicled not just as a financial failure, but as a moral one. While Jonathan thrived, directing his brilliance toward companies that valued diversity and dignity. His legacy built not on revenge but on proving that success rooted in justice endures longer than empires built on exclusion. For those who heard his story, whether in whispered conversations, news reports, or social media threads, the impact was undeniably became more than just a tale of corporate collapse. It became a mirror reflecting the hidden cost of prejudice. A question etched into the minds of all who listened: how many more brilliant minds have been turned away? How many leaders dismissed? How many opportunities lost because arrogance allowed racism to masquerade as judgment? And how much stronger could our world be if dignity and respect were the only gatekeepers to opportunity? Jonathan's triumph was not only personal, but universal, a reminder that racism, whether blatant or subtle, is not just an injustice to individuals but a slow poison that destroys institutions, reputations, and futures. And so, as this story ends, the question lingers for you, the listener: what role will you play in either tearing down or holding up the walls of prejudice? And when the moment comes for you to choose between silence and justice, will you stand by ignorance, or will you, like Jonathan, let dignity speak louder than arrogance? Because the truth remains unshakable. Respect is not optional. Humanity is not negotiable. And no